IB Teacher
IB
Talk.
Teacher
IB
Talk.
Teacher Talk.
Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of IB Teacher Talk. I am your host, Daniel Lambert, and I am here with...
I am Rachael Smith. Dan, what is IB Teacher Talk?
I'm very glad you asked me that question, Rachel, because today we're going to try and explain exactly what we're going to be doing with this podcast.
That sounds awesome. I'm excited.
Well, I think that most importantly, we want to get to the people behind the teachers. And also, we want to find out something useful from them that we can apply to our classes.
Right. So I think what you're trying to say is we're going to talk to teachers.
That's the name of the show. Yeah, correct.
Specifically IB teachers. Is it only for IB teachers?
It's aimed at IB teachers, I think it's fair to say, but I think that most teachers will find things in the podcast that they can appreciate and apply to their own classrooms. I mean, teaching is teaching is teaching is teaching. So, Rachel, let's clear up a little bit. What exactly is the IB?
My understanding of the IB is that it is the International Baccalaureate. It is a curriculum that we have chosen to follow. There's schools all over the world. I think it's pretty great. However, we are officially not a part of the IB, and we need to mention that as a disclaimer because we're going to use a lot of acronyms related to the IB, but we also are not part of it.
I think it's fair to say that we are believers in the IB curriculum and the ethos that is behind it.
I do think there's a lot of good within the IB curriculum.
Quite right. So, we'll be exploring a lot of those things in our podcast, talking about what elements of the IB do we like and where would we like to see change.
So let's get started with that. What is TOK? We'll hear that one quite often.
We will. And TOK is an acronym which stands for Theory of Knowledge. And theory of knowledge is one of the three core elements of the IB, isn't it, Rachel?
It is. Have you ever taught theory of knowledge?
I have indeed, actually. I taught it as a joint class. So I taught it with a Mandarin-speaking teacher, and the class was half in English and half in Mandarin. So it was fascinating, difficult, and very, very insightful.
If you had to summarize TOK in 2 lines, how would you summarize it?
Trying to understand how we know what we know is truth.
So just justifying your knowledge.
Can I just say I did it in 1 line?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
I'm an overachiever, Rachel.
Me too.
We know.
And during the podcast, after we go through this focus on IB, we'll also, at the end, connect it to TOK and then give a book recommendation.
Wow, that's excellent. So listeners are really going to get so much from this podcast, aren't they? They're going to learn about teachers, they're going to learn about TOK, they're going to get a book recommendation, but then
they get a voice from students.
Wow. It's almost as if students are important parts of teachers' lives.
I think they are.
They are, indeed. And all jokes aside, we'll have an interview with a student who's completed the IB at the end of every episode, because we do honestly think it's really important to hear the student's voice and their reactions to what they enjoyed, what they disliked, and maybe even their suggestions for change for the IB. So to conclude, Rachel, can you tell us exactly what this IB Teacher Talk podcast is about?
So this podcast aims to listen to teachers, to hear their voices, and to see their perspective on the IB, but also their classroom. And hopefully, as we said before, we can take something away from it as teachers and put that information into our classroom and see our students in a new light.
Excellent. I would sum it up as teachers learning from other teachers.
That's even better than what I said.
Because I'm brilliant. Sorry, I can't help it. I'm fantastic. Rachel, I think it's also important for us to introduce ourselves a little bit to people who will be listening to the podcast. So for this first episode, I suggest that we interview each other.
I think that's a great idea. Dan, who are you?
Well, my name is Daniel Lambert, and I was born in Liverpool in the United Kingdom. I moved to London when I was 3, so hence I don't have a very thick Scouse accent. And I've traveled a lot. I've lived in South Africa, I've lived in France, I've lived in Canada, I've lived in Taiwan, and I've lived in Singapore. And I've been teaching in international schools for about 8 years, and I've been teaching in local high schools for about 8 years previous to that. Before I started teaching, I did a selection of other interesting jobs like working for a homeless charity. I also worked for an app development company, and I tried to sell Mars bars.
Chocolate is great. I know you like chocolate.
I'm a big fan of chocolate. But Rachel, let me ask you, how did you get into teaching?
Oh, well, I wanted to be better than the teachers I had.
That doesn't sound like you.
No, not at all. I was always very passionate about literature and language. And I was the student that was reading books under my desk during math class. Why wasn't math interesting? Maybe it was the teacher, maybe it's just me. But I think that we need to consider that atmosphere that I was in, right?
So tell us what was so wrong with your classroom environments.
Now, as a teacher, I do know that there are some amazing things I can learn from science and math. Why wasn't I up more, wandering around, talking with other people?
Well, we'll talk to some teachers who teach maths and some sciences, so hopefully we can both learn from them.
I would love that. Like, why? Why chemistry?
Who knows? Hopefully chemistry teachers will enlighten us about this.
That'd be great. So, Dan, why is our subject the best?
Why is English the best?
Why is language and literature the best subject?
Okay, well, I teach the English literature course and I teach the language and literature course. And I'm constantly deciding which of those two is the best. So I really like literature. It's such a fantastic course because you get to build an array of texts which have diversity, gender diversity, regional diversity, and time diversity. And it really it enables each teacher to build a course based on their interest and perhaps something that suits their students really well. However, at the same time, I find that the language and literature course has more possibilities of connecting to how students will see how English is used in daily life. Mm-hmm. So can I flip this back on you and ask you why you think that language and literature is the most important or perhaps the best course?
I dare to say that if I could only teach one of them, I would just teach language.
Wow.
I think language is the best part of language and literature.
Why so?
You just said it. Kids are able to recognize language in their everyday life, and language makes up the novel, right? So if we're looking at the language, then we can say, okay, now let's look at the novel. Let's look at, a nonfiction or fiction piece. And I think that if we ignore the basic building blocks of what a book is made out of, we're missing something.
It feels like language and literature are married in the same way that perhaps maths and physics are. Rachel, over the course of this podcast, we're going to be trying to find out amusing stories from teachers' classrooms. So I think it's only fair for me to ask you if you could tell me an amusing tale from your classroom.
Where do I start?
Keep it legal.
Yeah, well, let's give a couple quick ones. How about the first time I was in a classroom in Arizona and I called a kid Jesus instead of Jesus because I was a Midwestern kid,
Pronunciation is important.
Wow, I had to learn that the hard way. You lose a kid so fast after that, right?
No doubt.
How about the time that I showed something wildly inappropriate, not me, but my students' presentation, because I forgot that I had to look at their work before they presented to the entire class.
There's a message to all teachers.
I learned quickly. How about the time I stood up to swat a bee that was terrorizing my students, and as I stepped up to hit it, I almost fell off the table, and I uttered a word that I shouldn't have.
Wow, I bet the students really enjoyed it, though.
But all of those moments are a moment for me to show that I'm human, and we can talk about the issue and talk about what happened, and we can relate to it, right?
Welcome to IB Teacher Talk.
So when you started teaching, Dan, did you get any advice that you thought was pretty good?
Yeah, I had a lot of advice that I thought was really good. And I'm going to attribute something to my mother, but she stole it from Oscar Wilde. And the message was everything in moderation, even moderation. So we're not talking about moderating assessments. Mm-hmm. I'm just talking about every now and then just go crazy and go wild. And don't hold back. Do something crazy every now and then, as long as nobody gets hurt and nobody can get sued.
Kids always remember that, right?
Rachel, every good teacher is constantly trying to improve.
I agree.
What are you trying to improve?
Excellent question, Dan.
You're welcome. It's your question.
Well, currently, I am very interested in retrieval practice. I first read about it, I think 2 years ago during a PD workshop. But essentially what it is that you are reviewing work from before and you are telling students, don't forget, we're going to build on it. So I make sure that I talk to kids about what I'm doing before I do it. and I talk with them how we're going to do it, right? We're always practicing getting that work out. Show me that content again. Don't forget we're doing this content. So I'm really interested in how that works and how I can better implement that in my classroom.
It's like making connections to previous learning. Is that correct?
Absolutely, because they have to build on their, especially in the DP, they have to build on their information. Yeah. They shouldn't forget it. What about you, Dan? What are you currently working on as your professional development?
My current professional development is learning from teachers by making them come and do interviews for a podcast.
Wow, that's really ingenious.
It's pretty smart, I know.
Yeah.
And you're my first victim. But other than that, I'm working on what I'm calling giving effective and actionable feedback, because I feel like I really need to improve on how to tell students not how they've done in an assessment, but how they can then go on to improve and get to the higher level mark bands that they all want to achieve. So I think I'm really trying to work on how to do that as best as I can, and I definitely need to improve.
Yeah, feedback is such an important part of our job, right?
Book reviews.
Book reviews.
Rachel, would you like to recommend a book for the listeners?
Yes, I would. I have recently reread Kitchen Confidential, and I'm now reading Medium Raw by Anthony Bourdain, and I am so fascinated by this guy. I mean, he now passed away, but he is not just a chef who's passionate about his art and food, but he's passionate about culture. He's passionate about media. He's passionate about language. He writes so well. If you've ever watched any of his shows, you can hear him in his words. Kitchen Confidential was when he was a chef, and Medium Raw is after he had become famous and was traveling, and people had seen him on TV, and he's dealing with that. I highly recommend reading the follow-up to Kitchen Confidential, which many people have not done.
Excellent. That sounds pretty cool. I'm actually considering adding that as non-fiction text to the literature course.
What about you, Dan? Do you have a book to recommend?
Can I preface this by saying that whenever you tell people you're an English teacher, they always say, oh, what's your favorite book? So I have to think, and it changes daily. So today, my favorite book is going to be a book by an American author called Cormac McCarthy, and he's the guy who wrote The Road. But I'm going to talk about Blood Meridian, which is another one of his works, and it's fantastically written. It's a little bit strange in places. He has a very interesting interpretation of how to use punctuation on occasions. So some of his paragraphs go on and on and on with no commas, no full stops, and they ramble and they become breathless, and you become very much involved in the description. It's very much a marriage of structure and content. And I think that he does that really, really well. It's a very violent and bloody tale of a boy and his travels through the Midwest and northern Mexico in the early 1800s, I suppose. And there's a fantastic villain in it, a guy called the Judge, who may be the most terrifying villain you will ever read.
Whoa.
I think that's enough.
Yeah. Whoa.
Great book, though, but terrifying and bloody. Rachel, at the end of every show, it's nice for us to have a look back and see what our takeaways are. So do you have any takeaways from this first show?
Let me think about that for a second. Yes.
That was easy.
It seems like this show will be very focused on excellent management of classrooms. We've talked a couple times about what we would do in a situation where a student would be maybe struggling or unruly or needed refocused. Additionally, I think it was great to hear where we came from, because all teachers were once students.
Yeah, very true. Can I say my takeaways were it was really fun learning your background and the things that you seem to be really passionate about and the things that I've seen in your classroom. And just hearing that from you is, for me, it's interesting because I always feel I can learn so much from other teachers. I know I've learned a lot from you, and I hope to learn a lot more over the course of this podcast.
You flatter me so. I'm excited about this opportunity. I've learned so much from you already. Thank you.
Don't worry, I'm usually really rude, so those moments are rare. Thank you for joining us for IB Teacher Talk's first episode. We will be back next week when we're interviewing another teacher with another direction and another perspective.
This is just a starting point. We are looking for all the answers everywhere.
This is the springboard. Sploosh!
Sploosh.
That was landing in the pool of knowledge.
Okay.